Welcome to Educator's podcast. My name is Swapnil. I'm an intensivist from St. George Hospital in Sydney. And today we have an exceptional guest and a podcast maestro, Dr. Anton Hellman. Dr. Anton is an emergency physician at North York General in Toronto. He is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Division of Emergency Medicine, and the Education Innovation Lead at the Schwartz-Reisman Emergency Medicine Institute. He is the founder, editor-in-chief, and host of very popular website, Emergency Medicine Cases. Welcome, Anton.
Thanks a lot for having me on the show, man.
Great. So today's podcast is about how to create a podcast, and you are the expert in this topic. So let me start by asking you why modern world health professional educator should bother about creating a podcast.
Well, I got to say there's dozens of good reasons why medical educators should learn about podcasting, but I'll stick to the really big important ones. First, podcasts are probably the most intimate medium to convey knowledge next to being in a room with the actual educator themselves. So it's kind of the perfect medium to convey your unique voice, both literally and figuratively, as an educator. You know, with podcasts, you have the ears and attention of literally thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of listeners around the globe who can learn, while they're commuting or exercising, which in this fast-paced world we live in is ideal. There's sort of this intimacy that you develop with your audience that you can't really find anywhere else so widely. So MedEd podcasts, essentially, they allow you to enter a global classroom. They allow you to enter a global classroom kind of thing. It's an elegant way of disseminating knowledge wide and far and sharing ideas through that sort of global community. It's probably the best way to convey tacit knowledge, the stuff that you get in the corridors at the hospital when speaking to colleagues and that. So with podcasts, people can listen and learn on their own time, when they're ready and when they're primed to learn, which is key rather than telling them when they have to learn. The other thing that's so great about podcasting as an educator is that as a podcaster, you get to hang out and learn from some of the most brilliant minds in medicine. So podcasting challenges me to expand my own thinking, engage with a community of like-minded educators and doctors, really ultimately so that we can all become better doctors. It's kind of like the ultimate in lifelong learning. And then the last thing I'd say on it is that I think that podcasting allows you really to be constantly creative. And in clinical medicine, we don't really get to create anything. And I think just creating things really ultimately just leads to a more fulfilling life. It's something that I've kind of always felt that I've needed to do is create something. So it kind of fills that void for me.
That's so true. Now, there are various educational digital outlets, for example, blogs, website, Twitter, journals, textbooks. How do you see the role of podcasts in this era of information overload?
That's a good question. So I think podcasts really are a good way of distilling knowledge down to really the bare essentials. When someone's speaking to you through your headphones or through your speakers, again, it's really intimate. And podcasts are really a way to disseminate knowledge widely that doesn't involve staring at a screen and constantly swiping and clicking, which in my opinion is kind of killing us as learners and as a social species in general. So it's good that way. The global impact with your educational podcasts is very likely to be much bigger than any article, blog, or textbook that you write. I know for EM cases, the podcasts are downloaded up to 200,000 times every month, and written educational material can't really get close to those kind of numbers. That being said, I think the best education comes from spaced repetitive multimodal learning. So, listening to a podcast, then a little while later reading a summary of the podcast, then watching a video on the topic, and then finally the best is to then take a quiz on the material. That's actually what we're trying to do with the EM Cases learning system, which takes you through the various learning media to help really just etch that knowledge into your brain.
Okay, now the EM Cases is a huge success. If a budding educator wants to start a podcast series like EM Cases, what does he or she needs to do?
Well, first you got to come up with sort of an original sort of niche or idea for your podcast, or just have something to say. Because if you have nothing to say, no one's going to listen. And then the logistics are actually relatively simple if you just want to get started out. You buy or borrow some basic hardware and computer software. You come up with an original format. You script out a few episodes, record them, edit them, and then post them to iTunes. All of that is a little bit easier said than done, but it's not too difficult if you just want to kind of get started.
Okay, so having an original idea is the key. Now, you mentioned that the recording, it's kind of easier, and a lot of educators actually struggle to understand this concept of recording a podcast. Can you tell us more about the podcast equipment and which equipment you prefer and how we should go about it?
All right. Well, I would say, for a very basic setup, all you really need is like $100 ATR 2100 USB microphone, as an example. Make sure you have a pop filter, a laptop, and then software to record. So GarageBand or Audacity, and a set of headphones. I mean, that's really all you need. You got to understand basic mic technique, which is pretty straightforward, and basic editing is easy enough as well. But if you want your podcast to sound professional, it really does require an investment of money and of time to learn all that technical knowledge that you need to acquire. So if you're going to do it right, you need to buy decent editing software, something like Hindenburg Journalist, I highly recommend. You'll need a podcast host like Blueberry or Libsyn are the two big ones that they also cost a few bucks. You might need to buy a URL name, for example, which costs a little bit of money. You need to get a reliable server. If you're going to have thousands of downloads, you're going to need a server that can handle it. You're going to have to invest in web security so your site doesn't get hacked, which mine did a few years ago. So I learned the hard way. You might want to invest in an email blast service, which might cost you a bit. There's all these little sort of hidden costs that you don't really think about when you're starting out. And the list kind of goes on from there. And then when it comes to actual hardware gear, to get a really great sound quality, professional sounding podcast, you need to spend at least about $150 on each microphone. If you're going to be recording in the field or in a studio around the table, you'll need some sort of recorder, which can, for a decent one, you're spending many hundreds, 1,000, even more than that, to buy a decent recorder. And then there's the time invested in learning how to do advanced editing. So learning how to apply things like equalization, compression, noise reduction, eliminating the hum, mastering the audio files. So really, you can start a podcast and try and learn all this stuff on the way. And it took me several years of because when I started, there weren't many other people doing it. So it was a lot of just trial and error. So that was pretty painful. But now, luckily, there's a lot of people podcasting out there, so there's a lot of help around to help you get going.
Can you please briefly outline the podcast creation process?
All right. So the ideas for the podcast topics, they come from a variety of sources. So some are from formal needs assessments. There's an organization called TREC, which stands for Translating Emergency Knowledge for Kids. That's this amazing organization who's trying to improve pediatric emergency care across Canada. And they did a needs assessment to see what emergency physicians needed out there in terms of knowledge acquisition for pediatric emergencies. And we chose the topics based on that needs assessment. So that's one example. Another example might be, I might just meet some mind-blowing expert in some particular topic, and we'll decide to do a podcast together. Other topics stem from, there might be a big new study that docs should know about, and then we build a podcast out of that. Some of them are suggestions from EMCase's listeners, and then others are just kind of key topics that sort of need to be covered. So once we got a topic, then usually what I do is I invite the guest experts in that topic, and I ask them to send me a list of 5 or 10 key points that they want to convey on that topic, to send me any key landmark articles or review articles. And then my team and I do some background research. we look at the textbooks, we look at the journals, we speak to other experts, we look online, and then we write up a loose script that I then send the guest experts a couple of weeks prior to the recording. And then during the recording, we follow the basic outline of the script, but we often veer off when something interesting comes up. And then there's the editing process. So there's the basic voice editing that I've got a couple of team members doing. Then we do the content editing, and then the sound design, which is one of my favorite things to do. A lot of podcasters don't find editing very much fun, but I find it kind of very zen and enjoyable. Then a couple of team members write up a written summary. I edit it, and then it's all posted together with some social media and email blasts. So that's pretty much the process from beginning to end, with at least for the main podcast episodes.
And you mentioned initially that as initial podcaster, you struggle and you made your way by learning from others. Now, I noticed that you are conducting a fantastic podcast teaching course. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So in October 2018 in Toronto, I'll be running a course called Podcast Camp. And it's a 2-day hands-on intensive small group course that's basically dedicated to medical education podcast production, put on by myself and other podcasters for podcasters who are interested in education, medical education in particular. So whether someone's just starting out or whether they've already got a podcast and just want to up their game, it'll be a lot of fun. We basically go through the entire production process, educational principles, scripting, interviewing techniques. We do basic editing, sound design, and it's a lot of fun because at the end of the course, all the participants actually create a podcast during the course, and then we have this fun pod war at the end where we critique each other's podcasts, and so that everyone can up their game. And this year we've got Hans Rosenberg from MRAP, who'll be guest faculty. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, and we'll probably be doing it at least annually.
Oh, that sounds like a great course. Now, if the budding educator can't attend that course, are there any resources out there that you will highly recommend so that they can read and at least start the basic workup?
Well, I have created a guidebook for medical education podcasting that at present is only going to be available for Podcast Camp registrants. But we'll see how it's received. If it's received well, I may consider having that book available as a separate purchase online at podcastcamp.org.
Sounds like a good idea. Now, what's your advice to a budding educator?
For podcasting educators, I would say that podcasting is a team sport. I mean, it's possible to do it alone. There are podcasters out there that do it alone, but if you really want to build something great, I think you should find some like-minded individuals who all have sort of a common goal and build it up from there. The other thing is, I really think it's important to sort of know yourself. If you can combine some unique skill that you've developed outside of medicine or education that you're passionate about, and you combine that with what you're passionate about in medicine, and then that'll help develop yourself as a unique educator. Don't be afraid to convey your personality on a podcast. I mean, that's what listeners really like. They like to actually hear an actual person talking to them. And the thing about podcasting in particular, when it comes to starting out as an educator, is that we usually don't think of education as something that needs to be especially entertaining. It was the great Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan who coined the phrase, "The medium is the message." But he also said, anyone who tries to make a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either. So I think it's important to have some sort of, whether it's going to be some jokes or some good sound design and music, or anything that's entertaining. I think that's a really important element when you're starting out, because if your podcast is boring, no one's going to listen. The other thing I'd suggest for people starting out is to listen to some non-medical, well-known podcasts, and that'll give them some production ideas. And then I think it's true for pretty much anything in life, but especially for trying to be an educator, is to embrace failure. I think it was Winston Churchill who famously said, "Success consists of going from failure to failure without the loss of enthusiasm." So if you combine that enthusiasm, with a good healthy dose of skepticism, that'll help lead the way to a successful career in podcast education. And really, once you got that passion, the rest is just diving in with both feet and having fun.
Oh, that's such a great advice. Now, if any budding educator wants to contact you or get in touch with you, or if they have any more questions, what's your best contact details?
Probably the best one is just to email me at Anton, that's Anton, at emergencymedicinecases.com.
Okay. Thanks, Anton. Thanks for your valuable time. I think it's quite good learning experience for all of us. I'm pretty sure we're looking forward to listening from Podcast Camp.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Swapnil. It was a blast. Take care.